This time on Poll Hub, our last national poll before Election Day has lots of news. We'll check in on the horse race, the issues, and which voters, if any, are left to persuade. Then, we've been asking sports fans about their viewing habits. Ratings show that viewing of live sports is down, but why? Well, we have some answers from our poll conducted in conjunction with the college's Center for Sports Communications. So, play ball! And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
So this is our last national poll that we've done with NPR and PBS NewsHour before the election. We are a little less than 3 weeks away from the election, a little fewer than 3 weeks away from the election. And national polls, as we learned in 2016, can only tell you so much. But the one thing this poll tells us is that our poll, along with lots of other really good national polls, seem to be really good news for Joe Biden. In this poll, he's up by 11.
Well, yeah, he has 54% to President Trump's 43%, which is in line with a number of the other averages. We always do seem to come out right in the middle of all the averages. I'm not quite sure how that always happens, but I think that there's some interesting kind of signs in this poll for both Vice President Joe Biden and President Trump. I mean, Biden has, strong support, obviously, among, the Democratic base. Trump has an incredible support among his base. And that's really where the similarities between now and 2016 end.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on under the hood in this poll. Biden doesn't do quite as well among Latinos than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. That's not a new narrative, but certainly something that is playing out. He is, however, doing much better than Hillary Clinton did among white voters, particularly women. And we always make we always look to make a difference between voters who have a college degree and those who don't. And while there is a wide difference there, Biden has made very strong inroads among women in general. So that is really something to look at as we're going into the last few weeks. The other thing for Biden is the traction that he's gotten among voters 65 plus. I think that that's a real difference. That's a place where Trump really outdistanced Clinton, particularly in places like Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin. So that's all good news for Biden. On the downside for Biden, I think you see the enthusiasm among Trump supporters. You also see that Trump, in addition to his base, has made some inroads with Latino voters, particularly in places that are going to be really important, like Florida. We don't have that specifically, the numbers for that in this national poll, but we see it overall that Trump is doing well among Latino voters, and we know from our state polling that it's specifically, among Latinos who tend to have been here longer, who have come from, countries where there have been, socialist regimes, and he has really touched a chord with that group of voters. The other interesting thing I just wanted to point to is the fact that we keep saying this is baked in, and we've seen the same numbers for so long. We all keep waiting for this big change to occur. But right now, 5% of voters say that they are persuadable. That is, they're either undecided, or when they told us they supported a candidate, they also said that they might change their mind. So this is going to be a really crazy and interesting 2.5 weeks to go.
Barb, let me just pick up on that point, because we're hearing so much about, well, what happened in 2016 is going to play out potentially again now. These are two very different campaigns. Clearly, you have an incumbent right now in Donald Trump, where he was not in that role in 2016, and you have the virus out there right now, which is just totally dominating what would have been maybe a discussion that would have been more comfortable for him, like the economy, where he runs pretty much neck and neck with Joe Biden in terms of who's better able to handle the economy.
Although that's been a change. That has been a change.
And that's changed. It's gotten closer. But here you go. What we saw in 2016 was there was constant change. So, it was up and down, conventions, debates. There was always this movement back and forth. And then you had the Access Hollywood tapes, and that really, put Hillary's numbers up. And then you had the Comey letter at the end, and that sort of began the descent into where we ended up. But what we're seeing right now is that the national polls, which aren't indicative of the states necessarily, but they're running about 5 to 7 points better, and maybe even a little more than that for Joe Biden than Hillary Clinton had. And what I'm thinking about is that's really interesting in this is that he's doing well, even or better in all 4 regions of the country, including the industrial Midwest. And I must say, he was getting criticized during the primaries because, people gave him up for dead. He came back off the canvas and took the nomination by storm. And people have been saying, well, he's got to campaign more. Maybe not being seen so much is not that terrible for him. And Donald Trump, I was just going to say that Donald Trump is sort of running against Hillary Clinton again. And he's talking about winning again. And now he's bringing up Hunter Biden. And frankly, I just think that's a misplace of a strategy. It's great for the base, but right now you got to get past that.
You mentioned the fact that there's so few persuadables, and there's another thing that we look at least in politics you look at, and that is, are you over 50%? So you can be up by 10, but if it's 45-35, that doesn't mean you're winning.
Good point.
That 50% number is very, very important. Hillary Clinton was never over 50%. I mean, there may have been a poll. So find the poll. You'll find one, an October poll where she was over 50%. I'm sure there's one. By and large, she was never over 50%. In fact, she wasn't really even much over 45%. And so even when we ask the question of, are you undecided, or we try and push people out of undecided to make a decision, and you look at the number of people who are undecided, unsure, voting for third-party candidates, those numbers were in double digits in almost all the reputable polls throughout all of October nationally in 2016. That group has shrunk to, at best, we have 5%. That's at best. I mean, there are other polls showing there's like 1%, 2% that are undecided. I do think that with all the people who've already voted, with all the votes that have already taken place, that this really is largely baked in. That does not account for, however, something that we didn't ask about in 2016, or very few people did, and that is what you think is going to happen on election day or the night of election night, meaning how the votes are counted. And I think that if we're talking for an October surprise, it's not an October surprise. There's no October surprise that's going to change the trajectory of this race, I don't think. A November surprise? Absolutely.
Yeah. And people do feel there's a issue of intimidation, and people are thinking, Democrats are worried about suppression, Republicans are worried about fraud, and it's just like more of the same. And I'm thinking that what's driving some of these numbers, because we're seeing, the Biden numbers being fairly significant. I think what's really driving some of these numbers is, there's a sense perhaps that people are getting a little bored of Donald Trump. He's in the 7th year or the 8th year of his show, and it's possible people want to cancel it at this point. Now, that's an overstatement when we're going to have to play this back in 3 weeks when we have a very different picture, I know. But right now, boy, it's been so steady. We haven't seen anything like that. I can't recall in a national race, and now we're talking about where are the candidates going. Donald Trump is campaigning in states he should have put away a long time ago. Internal polls are showing that.
I mean, it is a bit of a broken record. We've been saying on this podcast for almost 3 years, nothing changes in his approval-disapproval rating, and that's still true. Here's a question, though, that is different than ones we've asked before, and I think this is another number that if you're in the Trump campaign, you just don't like, and that is, would you describe Donald Trump's time as president or his presidency as a failure or a success? And 54% say it's a failure. 54% is over 50. You have to win more than 50% to win the vote in a two-way race anyway. That's just a devastating number for a sitting president 2 weeks or 3 weeks before election day, for more than half of voters to think that what you have done in office has been a failure.
Yeah, and one other point, first of all, his approval rating right now at 41% is a tough place to be. But you mentioned two-way race, and that's a difference this time also, because Democrats feel that maybe they took it a little for granted last time, and Democrats are worried that Trump will somehow come off the canvas, and they're voting in droves right now in the early vote, which was anticipated. But there's no minor party candidates who are going to get the kind of votes that the 6% that they got last time. So Donald Trump's 46 or whatever the figure was, I think it was 46.
Yeah.
He's going to have to kick that up a little bit. And right now he's in the low 40s. He's got to get to the high 40s.
Right.
And the clock is ticking.
So two more quickies, just real quick from this poll. One is, of course, the Supreme Court seat in the nomination battle that's gone all this week. We have seen more likely voters saying, yes, Amy Coney Barrett should be confirmed immediately or just after the election. It's now at 66%. So only 1 in 3 likely voters think she should not be confirmed. That is a change, and that's not a change the Democrats would be particularly happy about. Republicans would be, on the other hand. And then coronavirus, which we've talked about all year long in all of our polls. I don't want to leave today's poll without mentioning that we asked again, and we've asked 4 times over this year, do you think, and we asked this to all registered voters and adults, but I'm going to pick the likely voters, that the threat of coronavirus is a real threat or it's blown out of proportion? And right now, 71% think it's a real threat, but 26%, 1 in 4 Americans still, after 215,000 people have died, believe that this threat is blown out of proportion. That, I can't say it shocks me anymore. I'm not sure there's much that could shock you in 2020, but that surprises me that there's not more kind of a reality check among likely voters after all that we've seen.
And an overwhelming majority think that there should be a national mandate to wear a mask. And the fact that the mask was made into a political issue when the history folks write up this election, I think that's going to be a big deal down the road. But we'll see. I mean, we still got a couple, zillion voters still to vote and be counted. But we can change the pace a little bit too. We got sports coming up, so why don't we move on to that?
Well, now I'd like to welcome Jane McManus, Director of the Marist Center for Sports Communication. Welcome to Poll Hub, Jane.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you so much.
And the reason for your visit this time around is we have a new Marist poll, which we've conducted in conjunction with your Center for Sports Communication here at Marist College. And it had some very interesting results. We looked specifically at viewership for live sports events and found that, similar to some of the other data that has been out there in Nielsen ratings, that there's been a decline in viewership of live sports events during this very trying times that we've seen over the last 8 months to a year. So you tell us a little bit about what you found in the poll and your thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I think that there was an assumption that when sports returned from hiatus, that people would flock back to watch it, that we had a lot of spare time. A lot of people have been home and have had, time that they would have been spending socializing that now could be their own. But what we found, and a clue was in the ratings from this summer, ratings across the board for sports broadcasts were down. And I think there was some expectation that would change when the NFL returned. And lo and behold, that first weekend the NFL came back, there was a dip, not as much as with other sports, but still a dip. And so we started a conversation then. What does this mean? What's the bigger meaning behind this? Is it just a blip? And why wouldn't people be watching? So we wanted to see if this held up, if it was something that people themselves were going to report that they were experiencing, as opposed to some outside source measuring them via ratings or whatever. And
well, sure, because Nielsen just measures the actual number of people watching. They don't really find out the why and the reasons, which is what surveys can do.
Absolutely. And that's where you all have been so incredibly critical for this. And we found that Americans say that they are watching sports. 46% of Americans say they're watching less sports. And I think that's pretty significant. So then, of course, next is the why. And it turns out that there isn't one overarching why. There are lots of reasons, whether it's the coronavirus, not being able to gather in groups to watch sports, that particularly Republicans were not interested in seeing athletes speak out in the context of their sport. You also have people who may not be very as interested, given the way the rules have had to change and the schedule changes and things playing out of season. So there are all of these different reasons, and they all break down. What's so interesting about this data is it all breaks down by demographics. Different demographics are pointing to different reasons for not watching. It's not just politics. It's not just athletes speaking out. It's not just the pandemic. It's all of these things.
I know I had my own, I'm a big sports fan, so I had some of my own concerns. It took a long time to get connected to the baseball season because for some reason it felt like there was always going to be an asterisk next to it. And the rules had changed and some of that was annoying. But I must say, from a production standpoint, I had a tough time getting used to the cardboard fans in the seats and the fake applause and rally calls that were going on there. Am I somewhat typical in all this, or is it just slow? Was it slow for me to get to the chase?
No, absolutely. And some fans really did report that. And incidentally, women reported that they were more bothered by that than men did in our survey, which was kind of interesting. But I found the same thing. I found myself listening to a Jets broadcast earlier this year, no fans in the stands, listening to the piped in crowd noise and hearing "Jets suck" come out. And I was like, if you're piping in the sound, why would you leave that in? But, I guess they wanted to be authentic, and the Jets, to be fair, do suck this year. So
well, as suffering Giant fans, we're really feeling your pain.
Yeah, and when they start booing when the Giants are unable to pick up a first down at a home game, which isn't home, that whole thing just it doesn't have a true, authentic ring to it. Could it be that football also, the season has just started and there was so much sports all at once that it got sort of like unfocused? So we had, basketball and baseball and football and car racing and tennis and all kinds of things.
Well, and championships as well.
Yeah. And so I just wonder whether there was sort of like from nothing we went to overload, and that just sort of seemed just out of sync somehow.
I do think that's part of it. And that's one of the things that we asked, if there are just other things to watch. And that's kind of getting at that idea that the buffet of choices is just too large. But that doesn't really account for all of it. And the reason for that is some of the research that you all had already done in the past in 2014 and 2017, which gives us some indication that whether or not this is a comparative dip or if this is just having to do with too many choices right now. And for example, the NFL went from having 68% of sports fans say they're following that either closely or fairly or very closely. And now that number has fallen to 52%, which is a significant drop. Now, is that forever? Probably not. There were also drops from 44 to 37% in Major League Baseball and in the NBA. Again, a significant amount, especially when you're talking about less room there as a percentage drop. And then same with NASCAR, 22 to 16. And I think what this is actually giving us a bigger hint at what's happening, as opposed to it just being there are lots of different reasons people aren't watching sports or say they aren't watching sports. We see in the comparative number the actual significance of that drop, and we see it's an actual phenomenon. It's not just one reason here or one reason there, a night not being able to tune in. It really is that people do not have the bandwidth right now for sports in the same way. And I think that's where your previous data was so helpful, in that it really did give us that comparison.
Yet at the same time of the top 10 programs like This Week on Television, 4 of them were sports, and mainly football, and the NBA Finals were as well. So yeah, the ratings have dropped, but and yeah, there are a lot of reasons for it. But I think this notion that there's cord cutting going on, there's so many other choices, And there's been other research that's shown that younger people have a lot less interest in sports than older generations. It does seem to me that what we're getting at when we look at the data and we look at the whys is, yeah, a lot of reasons, but a lot of reasons that all point pretty much in the same direction, which is that live sports viewing, well, still huge, top 10, right? Big ratings, is in long-term decline.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think some of those things kind of we were getting some hints about that pre-pandemic, right? Especially with younger viewers and how they're watching sports. But I agree with you. I think that if you really comb through this and you look at trends and what is just a temporary dip versus what is the seed of the next trend, I do think you can kind of see emerging that young people really are consuming sports differently. And that might be an area for follow-up.
Were you surprised at the political differences? I mean, usually, in politics, we always use sports analogies to describe, how a contest is going. But we usually look to sports as kind of something that can unify us, across partisan lines. But it wasn't true this time. It seems like there are some, political dynamics going on as well.
100%. And that was what was so interesting, is that I think there was this, there have been certain, and this is why this data is so helpful. There have been certain assumptions as to why people aren't watching sports as much. And we actually get to go ask them if that's right. And then people, I think sometimes when they tell us stuff, they're actually telling us exactly what's happening. And sometimes I think they're identifying with a tribe. Right. And so you have, in this particular instance, you have Republicans, self-reported Republicans, say that they're watching sports because of athletes taking political stances. And then you have self-identified Democratic voters saying that they are actually watching more sports for that reason, or it's not affecting how much sports they watch. And then you have, for example, Black fans say they're watching more because to support the idea of protest in the sports space. And I found that really interesting. And so I don't know how much it's affecting viewership, because again, the overall picture is actually down, and a lot of those would offset each other, right? The viewpoints of the Republicans and different demographics would seem to kind of actually bubble to a stalemate. But it does point to the idea that people are now recognizing what their tribal affiliation is when it comes to sports, and what they should be thinking, and what they and how they want to be seen as consuming sports. So I thought that was actually very interesting. Everything is polarized.
I thought because there weren't fans in the seats, there might be more viewing because they can't watch the game in person. But I'm just sort of kidding, because it doesn't add up to the kind of numbers that we have in terms of what the drop is and what it represents.
Well, for me, sports has always been about getting together with, family and friends and eating a lot of food.
Not much tailgating going on this year, I guess.
No, unfortunately not.
And that points to the disruption of routine.
Absolutely.
Yep, absolutely. And Jane, thank you so much for coming on podcast. And this was our podcast. It's really nice that we could sort of partner on this project, because we're all sports fans at heart, and politics and sports, it's for us, it's one and the same, and so it's great to have you on.
And this is not the end of it. This is just the beginning of some of the things we're going to be looking at down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much.
Well, that was a little change of pace, and that'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub, which is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith is our executive producer, Casey Schaff is our editor, and Amelia Morel, Leo Ruiz, Madeline Jones, and Marcello Bettman are getting so much good experience production assistants.
Yes, they are, and they keep us on track. Thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University. We always like to give them a shout out for providing us with the ability to look back at survey questions and results over the decades. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram.
And we talked about a lot of numbers and a lot of data today. Check the show notes. We've got links to both of the polls, both the national poll that we did with NPR PBS NewsHour and that sports viewing poll. You can dig into the data, and maybe you'll find insights that we didn't discuss today. Good luck with that, but maybe you can do it. Finally, if you like what you hear in Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on the podcasting app of your choice. Positive reviews help other people find us. So if you like us, this is the best way to let other people know. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe. We will see you next week. Stay safe.